Hello, and welcome to St. Alphonsus and our continuing conversation about growing in authentic spirituality. It's been a real pleasure, and I think a real blessing for us to be able to spend this time together. It gives us an opportunity to delve deeper into a subject that I know that we're interested in, and it's one that we can't often spend the time that we need to spend. It's not, as I mentioned yesterday, that spirituality is complex. When all is said and done, spirituality is quite disciplined, but it's also quite simple. It's just that getting to the understanding of the simplicity is probably a little difficult. And part of the reason is because it's been around so long and it's part of our human experience, and just layer upon layer upon layer upon layer of human experience has been added to the fabric that we call spirituality. And I think that one of the things that happens is all these different layers are added to the experience of spirituality, that it makes us more prone to become distracted in our own spiritual journey. Somehow we feel like we have to peel back each layer, each tradition, each practice, each custom, and somehow perfect it before we can get to the kernel, to get to the gold, to get to that which is necessary. And that really isn't true. Spirituality in a nutshell means waking up, as you say. It means learning how to focus and learning how to pay attention to the presence of God in your midst, all around you. It means seeing in a different way, trying to see as God sees. And the practices and the disciplines of religion are intended to help us become more focused. They're intended to help us to become more aware of what's going on. The practices and the disciplines are not the end in themselves. And sometimes I think we forget that. Because there's a great comfort in engaging a practice. There's a great comfort in believing that you are disciplined. And frankly, there is rewards that come as a result of being practiced and disciplined. And so when all is said and done, there's an appeal to it. But we have to remember that as appealing as it is perhaps to perfect practices and disciplines, the main purpose of a practice and the main purpose of a discipline is lead you to a deeper awareness. You're supposed to move, I don't want to use the word supposed, you're invited within the Christian tradition by the Spirit of God to move on beyond the practice, to move on beyond the discipline, and to develop something more, something deeper, something that's much more profound. That's why I mentioned, I believe it was yesterday, that Jesus, when Jesus came, Jesus did not spend a lot of time talking to his friends and his disciples about practices and disciplines. He said, if you want to know anything about that, talk to the scribes and the Pharisees. They know how it works. They know what's important. They know what's necessary. But if you want to know how to enter into an intimate relationship with my Father in heaven, then let me show you the way. And the practices and the disciplines, if you want to call them that Jesus invited his followers to incorporate into their life, were based on the ability to see in a different way, to see everyone and the world in which we live as interconnected, as interdependent, that all of us are brothers and sisters, that everything that we have comes to us as a gift from God. So he invites us to see the world in a completely different way and to practice that by actually forgiving, by actually loving, by actually being patient, by actually being compassionate. We might say today, by putting your mouth where your thought is, or walking the walk. It's very relational. For Jesus, it's not enough to have big ideas. It's not enough to have wonderful thoughts. They're important. Big ideas and wonderful thoughts perhaps sometimes give us the energy that we need to make the choices that we need to make. But in and of themselves, that's not where it ends. It's in the relationship itself. It's in the doing, not just in the thinking. It's in the doing. So we try to encounter, we try to invest ourselves. We try to use the gifts that we've been given, the practices and the disciplines of our particular religious tradition to help us to get to the point of growth and development that follows. One of the biggest problems that we have with practices and disciplines is the power of distraction. Distraction is so powerful for the human person. And I'm not talking about the little everyday distractions, those little thoughts and feelings and stuff that come popping into your head all the time. I'm talking about the major distractions that take us away from what's important, and not necessarily in a bad sense. A lot of times, what seems to be distractive behavior is actually something that's good, but it's leading us further and further away from where we should be. So it's a good idea when one wants to talk about spirituality and one wants to develop their spirituality, to develop their awareness, to pay attention to what it is that distracts us. It can be a thing, it can be a person, it can be an event, it can be an experience, it can be all sorts of things. But to identify what those are, not that you necessarily want to avoid them or give them up or ignore them, but just so you're aware of the power that they have, the ability that they have. For instance, there's a game that you can play on your iPad, or you can play it on your phone, or you can play it actually in the old-fashioned way with actual dice and with cards, and it's called Yahtzee. And I can play Yahtzee for hours sometimes and not even know that I've been spending a couple hours playing it, because you get so caught up in trying to get the perfect numbers and trying to get the perfect hand. And there's nothing that's really pressing, actually. But at the same time, hours disappear. It's wonderful as a distraction, and sometimes it's important to be distracted. But we don't want the distraction to take away from what is really important in life. It doesn't want to be something that isolates you or puts you out of touch or disconnects you. It needs to be something that supports you, that makes you feel better for a while, but then you're able to lay it aside and to engage in something that is much more life-giving and much more important. I remember that in the retreat center in Tucson, when I was living there with Father Pat Hawk, who I've referenced many times, at the beginning of his extended retreats, he would give retreats for 8 days, 15 days. He even had a retreat that would go for 30 days, Christian contemplative retreats, trying to teach people how to be mindful, to pay attention to what they were doing. And one of the first things that you would notice in the retreat is all the people, the men and women who were making the retreat, would all be sitting by themselves. And they were practicing social distancing even before it was a common practice like it is today. They'd be sitting 6, 8, 10 feet apart from each other so that they could only basically see themselves and pay attention to what they were doing. And when you'd go in for mealtime and you'd watch them, you could see them taking forever to eat. And you could see them practicing, taking a fork full of something and slowly bringing it up to their mouth and chewing it, putting the fork down and tasting it. And you'd see it. It was kind of strange, actually, to see, 25, 30 people doing this all at the same time. What they were trying to do was they were trying to use a particular spiritual practice to pay attention. They were trying to focus their attention so that this didn't gulp down their meal and go on to something else, but they were trying to pay attention to what they were actually doing. And in the process of paying attention to what they are actually doing, to come to an appreciation, to come to an enjoyment of what they are actually doing. That's an important function, and that's an important experience. In the Buddhist tradition, there's even a prayer that goes along with this mindfulness, this mindful tradition of eating your food with a focused way. And this is the way that the prayer goes. You pray, "This food is the gift of the whole universe. the earth, the sky, and much hard work. May we live in a way that is worthy of the food. May we transform our unskillful states of mind, especially that of greed. May we eat only foods that nourish us and prevent illness. May we accept this food for the realization of the way of understanding and love. So in the Buddhist tradition, this, what's called the five contemplations, is a way to be mindful of what you're doing, to integrate even the most common part of yourself into an awareness, a deepening awareness, a deepening focus, paying attention to what's happening around you. It's not a silly thing, it's a wonderful thing, because it does, in fact, help you become more aware. And in the process of becoming more aware, it helps you become more grateful. It helps you to understand what it's mean to be blessed as you enjoy even the simplest things. So the practices and the disciplines that we've talked about are intended to help us to become focused. They're intended to help us to become more aware. They're intended to help us become more participatory in the world in which we live. That life is not just something that happens to you. That's something that you participate in. And the more aware, the more blessed, the more grateful that you become in the way that you live your life, and the way you interact with others, the more and more you can experience the fullness and the presence of God. I'd like to talk a little bit more this day about the wisdom of Jesus and specifically his attention to mindfulness. Now, you won't find anything in the sacred scriptures, the Christian scriptures, that talk about mindfulness. That's not a word that Jesus used, and it's not necessarily a concept that he taught. But in another sense, it is something that he was very much aware of, because he was offering his disciples a chance, a practice, a way to engage in life that would help them to become aware of the presence of God around them. They didn't need help in becoming aware of the Romans who occupied their land. They didn't need any help. The Romans were obviously present. The legions were there. The oppression was there. They didn't need any help to understand that they had nothing, that they were being taken for granted. They were being used. They were being abused. They didn't need anyone to help them come to that focus or that understanding. They didn't need any help to enter into the things that they would do automatically. Some of the things which they would do would be very good. Some of the things that they would do would be not so helpful. For instance, perhaps in extending benefit of the doubt to a member of your immediate family, which was something that was very common in the life of Jesus. But anyone outside of your family tradition, you didn't extend to them the benefit of the doubt. You doubted the benefit of what they were doing. Completely two different ways of looking at things. So that was so much a part of their DNA that they didn't need any help doing that. But they did need help understanding how God permeated the world, how God interconnected, and God's grace and God's life was everywhere, even in the midst of oppression, even in the midst of difficulty, to see that. And so Jesus tried to help his apostles and his disciples understand that. And he was very impatient with those who did not help people develop an attitude that was more grateful, more compassionate, more empathetic. For instance, this is what he says about those who insisted that the rules and regulations, the practices and the disciplines be totally, completely followed, but in the process of following them ignored everything of importance. He said about people who would do that, in this instance, the scribes and the Pharisees said, instead of giving you God's law as food and drink by which you can feast on God, they package it in bundles of rules, loading you down like pack animals. They seem to take pleasure in watching you stagger under those loads and wouldn't think of lifting a finger to help. Their lives are perpetual fashion shows, embroidered prayer shawls one day, and flowery prayers the next. And so Jesus was making a severe judgment on the scribes and the Pharisees, who were supposed to be the spiritual leaders of the day. He said they have become so driven by distraction, they have become so disconnected from the reality of the world in which they live. They have become so disconnected from the mercy and the grace and the love and the presence and the blessing of their Heavenly Father that they put all of their emphasis on rules and regulations, all of their emphasis on practices and disciplines, and as a result, never, ever help someone become aware of the presence of God. I remember, and I don't know if I'm going to get the story correct, and it's kind of a silly story, but I was thinking about it nonetheless. It's a story about a group of missionaries hundreds of years ago who visited somewhere in the South Seas, and they discovered an island where the people supposedly on the island knew nothing about God, knew nothing about what was important, at least from their perspective as Catholic missionaries. And they were only going to be there for a short time, so they decided that they would teach the people the Our Father, because that was a necessary prayer of the Christian life. So they taught them the Our Father. Then it was time, the ship had been reprovisioned, and it was time for the ship to leave. So the ship was pulling out of the harbor, and all of a sudden two elders of the people, the supposedly people who are bereft of any spirituality, any understanding of who God is, come walking across the water towards the boat. And they ask the priest, they say, exactly again, what were the words to the prayer that you were trying to teach us? It's a kind of a humorous story because obviously they are connected with God. They know who God is. And the missionaries perhaps had erred in their enthusiasm, you might want to say. And that's what Jesus was trying to help people understand. See the presence of God, experience the fullness of God. The practices and the disciplines that are part of who we are very helpful. They're very useful. But never get yourself to the point where you're distracted by them, where they become the center of everything, where they become the most important part of everything. Rather pay attention to the bigger thing, the bigger focus, the bigger presence, the bigger example and awareness of God's life and love. I think during this time of social distancing and this time of enforced, if you will, contemplation for many of us, where we're isolated and we're with less people than we're used to being with, and we're faced with more silence than we're used to being faced with, we're faced with all sorts of other things, there is a strong temptation to distract ourselves completely, to fill up the time of day with everything that we possibly can. So we go from frantic decision to frantic decision to frantic decision, just so that the time can be filled up. But there's others of us, even though we're offered this time, are not using it as something that we struggle with, but we're using it as a time to help us deepen our own sense of spirituality and our own sense of completion, our own sense of awareness. And I think that we're beginning to make some connections. We're beginning to see some things, things that surprise us. I know, for example, the other day I was talking to Father Chung at breakfast, and I was telling him about how I felt about this experience of being locked up. I don't want to really say we're locked up in the rectory, because we're not, and the rectory is large. But nonetheless, the experience of being confined to the space. And I found myself thinking about people in prison who are confined to a small 6x6 space every day, all day, for weeks, for months, for years, as a type of punishment. And I was just wondering about that. I don't want to make any political statements or anything, but I was just wondering about what does that do to a human person? What does that tell a human person about who they are? What does that call them forth to expect from the humans in which they encounter and live? Just a question. I wonder if I, who struggle with living in a rectory that's about probably 8,000 square feet on half a city block that I can walk around at will, I wonder how I would do in a 6x6 cell. And only being able to leave for an hour at a time every day. Just a thought. But it's one of those thoughts that help us understand the importance of our spiritual journey, our importance of coming to an awareness of who we are and how we stand in the eyes of God and what we're being asked to do. In his wisdom, going back to Jesus, Jesus encouraged people in the midst of all their practices and disciplines. He encouraged them to open up their eyes, to see in a different way. No matter how bad their day was, no matter how difficult it was, no matter how bowed down they might feel or oppressed that they feel, he invited them to open their eyes, to lift up their head, to see something that's much more powerful at work in the world. And in the process of doing that, to come to a realization of the presence of God as God's grace and God's life permeates the world in which we live. So that's also our challenge. That's our connection, to take the practices and the disciplines that we have, those things that help us become more aware, that help us become more focused, to take those things and to apply them in a way that helps us to see, that helps us to appreciate, that helps us to come to a further and deeper understanding of who God is. And with that, even though we're a little short today, not as long as normal, we're going to end there because we have the practices and the disciplines of Holy Week that are ahead of us. The well thought out and well celebrated liturgies of Holy Thursday, Good Friday, the Easter Vigil, and Easter Sunday. And this year, of course, they're going to be different. In fact, the liturgies are going to be stripped of many of the components that we're so very used to, because of the fact that we will not be having the congregations that are present. And ritual, especially dramatic ritual, makes no sense if a community's not there. So you'll see the practices and the disciplines of Holy Week kind of boiled down to the kernel of what they are. But even in the smallest kernel of what they are, there's a real power that can be there, a real experience of the presence of God, a real ability to focus on what's important and to be grateful. So for the rest of this Holy Week, let's pay attention to that which the church gives us. And even though as the people of God, we're not able to gather as we would hope to be able to gather, or even be able to gather one day again as a community, nonetheless, we can be strengthened and we can be nourished. When we come back next Monday, so the Monday after Easter, we'll continue with this spiritual conversation. And when we come back, we'll talk about even more connecting points of the spiritual journey. And hopefully they'll become, in a sense, more profound, because you will have the experience not only of being able to think about everything that we've shared these last week and a half, but you'll also be blessed with the mysteries of the Triduum and the great feast of Easter. God bless you. Have a great day.